My name is Daniel Brooks. If you saw me walking down the street, you probably wouldn't remember my face 5 minutes later. I've spent my entire life being invisible. Not because I wanted to be, but because people decided I was. Some men walk into a room and everyone turns to look. When I walked into a room, people looked away. Growing up in a small town outside Seattle, I learned something before I even turned 10. The world judges you long before it knows your name. My mother used to cup my face with both hands and say, "Daniel, God doesn't make mistakes." I wanted to believe her. But children don't care what your mother says. They care what they see. My skin was darker than everyone else's in school. My nose was crooked from an accident when I was little. I was painfully skinny. And my thick glasses made me look even stranger. By middle school, the nicknames had already started. Shadow, Crow, Scarecrow. Every day brought a new joke. Eventually, I stopped asking people to stop. I simply smiled, pretended it didn't hurt, and went home. Home wasn't much easier. Dad worked construction until a back injury forced him to quit. Mom cleaned offices at night. Money was always short. There were weeks when dinner was nothing more than canned soup and toast. But despite everything, my parents gave me one gift no one else ever did. They believed I mattered. Every birthday, Dad bought me a used book instead of an expensive present. He'd say, "People can take your money. They can laugh at your face. But they can't steal what's inside your mind." So I read everything. History, business, poetry, philosophy. Books became my closest friends. By the time I reached college, I had earned a scholarship to the University of Washington. It felt like the beginning of a new life. I honestly believed adults would be different. I was wrong. The jokes became quieter, more sophisticated. But they never disappeared. Girls smiled politely, then introduced me to their prettier friends. Professors remembered my grades, not my name. I graduated near the top of my class with a degree in economics. Yet somehow, the only job I could find was stocking shelves during the night shift at a grocery store. Every morning, I'd walk home while executives in tailored suits hurried toward downtown offices. I often wondered what separated me from them. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't work ethic. Maybe it was confidence. Or maybe it was simply the face looking back at me in the mirror. One rainy Thursday morning, I stopped by a small coffee shop before heading home. That's where I saw her. She sat alone by the window, reading a novel while softly smiling to herself. She wasn't the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. She was something rarer, peaceful. When she looked up, our eyes met for barely 2 seconds. She smiled. Not out of pity. Not because she recognized me. Just because I happened to be another human being. It was the first genuine smile a stranger had ever given me. I didn't know her name. I didn't know where she worked. I didn't even know if I'd ever see her again. But as I walked back into the rain, holding my cheap paper coffee cup, I realized something. Sometimes, one small act of kindness can give a lonely man enough hope to change the rest of his life. For the next 3 weeks, I stopped at that coffee shop every Thursday morning. Not because the coffee was good. It wasn't. The coffee tasted like burnt cardboard. But she was there. Always at the same table by the window. Always reading. Sometimes a novel. Sometimes a history book. Sometimes poetry. I never had the courage to speak to her. I'd order my coffee, sit across the room, and pretend to read while secretly wondering what kind of person smiled at strangers. On the 4th Thursday, something unexpected happened. As I reached for the sugar, my notebook slipped off the counter, pages scattered across the floor. Before I could pick them up, someone knelt beside me. It was her. She gathered the papers carefully, making sure they stayed in order. "You write?" Her voice was soft. I nodded awkwardly. "Mostly poems." She looked surprised. "Really? I love poetry." Nobody had ever said those words to me before. She handed me the notebook. I'm Ava. Daniel. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why do you always sit across the room instead of saying hello? I nearly choked on my coffee. You noticed? She laughed. You've been coming every Thursday for a month. It would have been hard not to. I felt my face grow warm. I didn't want to bother you. You weren't. You just looked lonely. That word hit harder than any insult I'd ever heard. Because it was true. She glanced at my notebook again. Would you read one of your poems? No. The answer escaped before I could think. She tilted her head. Why not? Because they're personal. She nodded respectfully. I understand. Then she picked up her novel. When you're ready, I'll listen. Over the next few weeks, Thursday mornings became my favorite part of life. We talked about books, music, dreams, travel. Never appearances. Never money. For the first time, someone wanted to know what I thought instead of what I looked like. One morning, as we walked outside together, a silver sports car pulled up beside us. A sharply dressed man stepped out. Confident, handsome, successful. He wrapped an arm around Ava's shoulders. There you are. She looked surprised. Daniel. This is my fiancé, Michael. My heart sank. Michael looked me up and down, then smiled politely. You must be the poet. I forced a smile. Something like that. As they drove away, I stood alone on the sidewalk. For the first time in months, the rain didn't feel cold. It simply felt familiar. For the next few months, I stopped going to the coffee shop. Not because I blamed Ava. She had done nothing wrong. She'd been kind to me. Kinder than anyone outside my family had ever been. But every Thursday reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. Hope can hurt just as much as rejection. Life returned to its routine. I stocked shelves from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. I slept through most afternoons. In the evenings, I wrote poetry in a worn notebook that no one ever read. One night, my supervisor walked over while I was organizing inventory. Daniel. The district manager wants to see you tomorrow. My stomach tightened. I couldn't think of anything I'd done wrong. The next afternoon, I walked into the regional office wearing the only suit I owned. It had belonged to my father. The sleeves were too long. The shoulders didn't fit. But it was all I had. The district manager introduced himself as Richard Coleman. He shook my hand firmly. I've been reviewing employee reports. You've never missed a shift. You've never been late. And according to your co-workers, you solve problems nobody else notices. I wasn't sure how to respond. He slid a spreadsheet across the desk. Our warehouse is losing money. Tell me why. I studied the numbers for several minutes. Then I pointed at 3 different columns. Your delivery routes overlap. You're ordering products based on estimates instead of demand. And nearly 15% of your inventory expires before it's sold. Richard stared at me. How long did it take you to figure that out? About 5 minutes. He leaned back and smiled. Then why are you stocking shelves? I looked down. No one's ever asked me anything else. 2 weeks later, he offered me a junior operations analyst position. The salary was almost double what I was making. For the first time in years, I felt like someone had seen more than my appearance. I called my parents the moment I signed the paperwork. Mom cried. Dad laughed so loudly I had to pull the phone away from my ear. I told you. No one can steal what's inside your mind. That night, I celebrated with a frozen pizza and a second-hand bottle of sparkling cider. It wasn't much, but it felt like the beginning of something. Before going to bed, I opened my notebook. Instead of writing another poem, I wrote a single sentence. Maybe the world isn't changing. Maybe I'm finally finding the place where I belong. I had no idea that this promotion would introduce me to people whose wealth and power would change my life forever. My first day as an operations analyst felt like the first day of school. New office, new coworkers, new responsibilities. I spent the entire morning trying not to look nervous. Most people barely noticed me. I was fine with that. Invisible had always been my natural state. Richard assigned me to review purchasing reports. It wasn't exciting work, but I loved finding patterns hidden inside numbers. To me, spreadsheets told stories. Stories about waste, opportunity, and bad decisions. About a month into the job, Richard called me into his office. "I need you to attend a fundraising gala next Friday." I frowned. "I think you've got the wrong person." He smiled. "No. I need someone who pays attention instead of showing off. The event is hosted by the Harrington Foundation. They're considering investing in our expansion. I want you there." Friday evening arrived faster than I expected. I rented a tuxedo that fit almost as badly as my father's old suit. The ballroom looked like something from a movie. Crystal chandeliers, live orchestra, people wearing watches that probably cost more than my apartment. I immediately felt out of place. While everyone else laughed and exchanged business cards, I quietly stood near a bookshelf with a glass of sparkling water. Then I heard a familiar voice. I knew it was you. I turned around. "Ava." For a second, I wondered if I was imagining things. She smiled exactly the way she had in the coffee shop. "Daniel. It's been a long time." "It has." She looked at my tuxedo and laughed softly. "You clean up pretty well." "So do you." She thanked me. For a few minutes, it felt like nothing had changed. Then I noticed something. There was no engagement ring on her hand. I hesitated before asking, "How's Michael?" Her smile faded. "We ended things." "I'm sorry." She shrugged. "Sometimes loving someone isn't enough." Before I could respond, an older gentleman approached us. Tall, silver-haired, distinguished. "Ava, aren't you going to introduce me?" She smiled. "Grandpa. This is Daniel Brooks. Daniel, this is William Harrington." The name hit me instantly. William Harrington, founder of the Harrington Foundation, one of the most respected businessmen in the Pacific Northwest. He shook my hand firmly. "So you're the young man who writes poetry?" I blinked. "You've heard about that?" Ava smiled. "I may have mentioned you once or twice." William chuckled. "Good. I've learned that people who understand poetry often understand people." He looked directly into my eyes. "I hope we'll have a chance to talk again." As he walked away, I had the strange feeling that this conversation was about to change my life in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. 3 days after the gala, I received a phone call that left me speechless. "Mr. Brooks? This is William Harrington's office. Mr. Harrington would like to invite you to lunch." I honestly thought they had the wrong number. "Are you sure you mean Daniel Brooks?" The assistant laughed politely. "Yes, Mr. Brooks. You." The restaurant overlooked Elliott Bay. It was the kind of place I'd only seen in magazines. William was already waiting when I arrived. He stood to greet me. "I'm glad you came." "So am I, although I'm still trying to figure out why I'm here." He smiled. "Because most successful people spend too much time talking. You spend your time listening." For the next hour, we barely discussed business. Instead, he asked about my parents, my childhood, the books I loved, the poems I wrote. Finally, he folded his hands. "Daniel, do you know why most wealthy people fail?" I shook my head. "They stop learning. They begin believing they're the smartest person in every room. He leaned forward. I've spent 50 years searching for people who are still curious. I think you're one of them. Before I could answer, he slid a folder across the table. Inside was a business proposal. The Harrington Foundation had recently purchased a struggling logistics company. We're losing millions. My executives keep giving me expensive solutions. I'd rather hear yours. I spent the next 20 minutes reviewing financial reports. The numbers reminded me of the warehouse I'd analyzed months earlier. Only much bigger. There are too many managers. Too many unnecessary warehouses. And nobody is looking at customer demand. William nodded slowly. My executive said exactly the opposite. I hesitated. Then they're wrong. For a second, I wondered if I'd just insulted a room full of millionaires. Instead, William burst into laughter. I was hoping you'd say that. A week later, Richard called me into his office. He looked unusually serious. I've received a request from William Harrington. He wants to borrow you for 6 months. What? To help restructure one of his companies. I stared at him. Why me? Richard smiled. Because genius usually arrives wearing ordinary clothes. That evening, I told my parents. Mom cried. Dad simply smiled. I've waited a long time for the world to notice my son. As I drove home, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ava. Grandpa says you're joining the team. Congratulations, Daniel. Don't let success change the kind man I met in that coffee shop. I smiled. I had no idea. That success wasn't what would change me. It was everything that came after. The Harrington Logistics headquarters occupied 23 floors in downtown Seattle. On my first day, I felt completely out of place. Everyone wore tailored suits. Everyone walked with confidence. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. I still caught myself apologizing whenever someone stepped aside to let me pass. William introduced me as a special consultant. The executives weren't impressed. One of them whispered just loudly enough for me to hear. That's the analyst? He looks like an intern. I pretended not to notice. I'd heard worse my entire life. For the first 2 weeks, I barely spoke during meetings. I listened. I watched. I filled notebook after notebook with observations. The problem wasn't complicated. Managers were making decisions based on pride instead of facts. Departments competed with each other instead of working together. Millions of dollars disappeared because nobody wanted to admit they were wrong. During the 3rd week, William asked me to present my findings. The boardroom fell silent as I stood. My hands trembled. Public speaking had always terrified me. I took a deep breath. Then I forgot about the people and focused on the numbers. For nearly an hour, I explained where the company was losing money. I proposed closing 2 warehouses, renegotiating supplier contracts, and redesigning the entire delivery network. When I finished, one executive laughed. That's impossible. I looked at him calmly. No. It's uncomfortable. There's a difference. William smiled. Let's try Daniel's plan. 3 months later, the company reported its first profitable quarter in nearly 4 years. The same executives who had ignored me now asked for my opinion before making decisions. Nothing about my appearance had changed. Only my results. One Friday evening, William invited me to dinner at his home. The mansion overlooked Lake Washington. It was beautiful, but strangely quiet. Halfway through dinner, Ava joined us. She smiled when she saw me. So, the famous consultant. I laughed. I don't think anyone's calling me famous. William pointed his fork toward me. They will. After dinner, Ava walked me to my car. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally she smiled. You've changed. My heart sank. I was afraid of that. She shook her head. No. Not in the way you think. You still listen before you speak. You still thank the waiters. You still carry that notebook everywhere. She looked directly into my eyes. The only thing that's changed is that you're finally starting to believe in yourself. For the first time in years, I didn't look away. I smiled back. Neither of us noticed. A black luxury sedan parked across the street. Inside, someone quietly lowered a camera. After taking several photographs of us together. The photographs appeared online 2 days later. At first, I didn't even know they existed. Then Richard called me into his office. He placed a tablet on the desk. A local business blog had published an article. The headline read, "Is William Harrington preparing his granddaughter's new boyfriend to take over the family empire?" I nearly laughed. Until I realized people believed it. The article claimed I'd secretly been promoted because I was dating Ava. It suggested William was favoring me instead of experienced executives. None of it was true. Richard leaned back. "How bad is this?" "It's nonsense." "I know. But rumors don't need evidence." That afternoon, I noticed something different. Co-workers who had recently begun respecting me were suddenly whispering again. The promotions I'd earned through hard work were now being explained away with gossip. By evening, Ava called. "I'm so sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for." "I think I do. My grandfather's name puts a target on everyone around us." I smiled. "My life had targets long before I met you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked softly, "Does this change anything?" I looked out my apartment window. Rain covered the streets below. "No. I'd still like to have coffee with you." She laughed. "So would I." The following Saturday, we met at the same coffee shop where we'd first spoken. Nothing had changed. The tables were still too small. The coffee was still terrible. Yet somehow, it still felt like my favorite place in the city. For nearly 3 hours, we talked. She admitted Michael had never truly loved her. He'd been more interested in the Harrington name than the woman behind it. I ignored all the warning signs. "Why?" She stared into her coffee. "Because everyone kept telling me he was perfect. And sometimes, when enough people repeat the same lie, you start believing it." I understood exactly what she meant. People had spent my entire life telling me I wasn't enough. For years, I believed them. As we stood to leave, Ava reached into her purse. She handed me a small envelope. "Don't open it until you get home." That night, I carefully unfolded the note inside. It contained only one sentence. "The world spent years convincing you that you were invisible. Thank you for finally letting someone see you." I read those words again. And again. For the first time in my life, someone wasn't falling in love with my success. She was falling in love with the man I'd always been. A week after Ava gave me that letter, William invited me to his office. His assistant closed the door behind me. For a long moment, he simply looked out the window. "I've spent my entire life building companies. But lately, I've been thinking more about what I'll leave behind." I stayed quiet. William appreciated people who listened. Finally, he turned toward me. "Daniel, I want you to become Chief Strategy Officer." I thought I'd misheard him. "I've only been here a few months." "Exactly. You haven't had years to learn bad habits." I hesitated. "There are people here with decades of experience." William nodded. "And many of them have decades of excuses." By the end of the week, the announcement was public. The reaction inside the company was immediate. Some congratulated me sincerely. Others stopped speaking to me altogether. One executive resigned. Another accused William of favoritism during a board meeting. William answered with a single sentence. If results offend you, you are welcome to outperform him. No one did. As my responsibilities grew, so did my income. I paid off my parents' mortgage. I replaced Dad's 20-year-old pickup truck. I convinced Mom to finally retire. She cried when I handed her the house documents. You've done enough for us. I smiled. You spent your whole lives giving me everything you could. This is just my turn. One evening, Ava invited me to walk along the Seattle waterfront. The sun was setting behind the Olympic Mountains. The air smelled of salt and rain. She suddenly stopped walking. Daniel, can I ask you something? Anything. Why have you never asked me out? I laughed nervously. Because I assumed someone like you would never choose someone like me. She looked almost disappointed. After everything we've shared, you still don't see yourself the way I do. She stepped closer. Daniel, I've met men who were handsome. I've met men who were wealthy. I've met men who were powerful. But I've never met anyone who makes every person around him feel important. I couldn't find the words. She smiled. So let me make this easier. She reached for my hand. Daniel Brooks, would you please take me on our first real date? For years, I dreamed of hearing someone choose me. Not because of money. Not because of success. Not because of pity. Just because I was me. I smiled through tears. I'd love to. As we walked away together, neither of us noticed the man watching from across the street, holding a folder marked, Harrington Estates Succession Plan. Dating Ava felt almost unreal. For years, I'd convinced myself that love belonged to other people. People with perfect smiles, perfect faces, perfect lives. Then she came along, and quietly destroyed every lie I'd believed about myself. We never cared much for expensive restaurants. Most weekends, we visited bookstores, walked through Pike Place Market, or sat beside the water talking until sunset. She listened whenever I read my poetry. Not once did she interrupt. Not once did she pretend to understand. She simply listened. One evening, she closed my notebook after I finished reading. You know what's beautiful about your poems? I smiled. They rhyme? She laughed. No. They're honest. Most people spend their lives trying to sound impressive. You spend yours trying to tell the truth. Her words stayed with me. Because honesty had never felt like a strength. It had always felt like survival. A month later, William invited me to his home again. Dinner ended early. Instead of joining Ava in the garden, William asked me to remain behind. He poured 2 cups of coffee, then handed one to me. Daniel, what are your intentions with my granddaughter? It wasn't an angry question. It was a grandfather's question. I answered honestly. I love her. The words surprised even me. Because until that moment, I hadn't admitted them aloud. William nodded slowly. I was hoping you'd say that. He reached into his desk drawer. Instead of taking out business papers, he removed an old leather journal. It belonged to my wife. We were married for 53 years. He gently ran his hand across the worn cover. Do you know what she wrote on the first page? I shook my head. He opened the journal. Then quietly read the sentence. Choose the person who gives you peace. Not excitement. The excitement always fades. The peace remains. He closed the journal. When Ava smiles around you, she reminds me of my wife. My throat tightened. I'll spend the rest of my life protecting that smile. William stood, walked around the desk, and embraced me like family. As I left his office, I noticed 2 men in expensive suits walking toward the house. They looked serious. One carried a thick stack of legal documents. Before the front door closed, I heard one sentence. "Mr. Harrington, it's time to discuss your will." I didn't realize it then, but that conversation would soon turn my quiet life into the center of a battle no amount of money could stop. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. William officially announced his retirement. The business world reacted with shock. Television analysts debated who would eventually lead the Harrington Group. Some predicted a veteran executive. Others expected the board to hire an outsider. No one mentioned me. I preferred it that way. My goal had never been power. It had always been purpose. Then everything changed on a Monday morning. William collapsed during a board meeting. An ambulance arrived within minutes. The entire office froze. Ava called me while I was driving to the hospital. Her voice was trembling. "They think it's his heart." When I reached the waiting room, she was sitting alone. The confident woman I'd come to know looked frightened. Without saying a word, I sat beside her. She rested her head on my shoulder. Hours passed before the doctor appeared. The surgery was successful. But Mr. Harrington needs to slow down. Stress nearly killed him. Relief filled the room. For the first time that day, Ava smiled. A week later, William asked to see me privately. He looked weaker than I'd ever seen him. "Daniel, I've spent too many years building companies. I neglected the people I loved." He looked toward the window. "Money makes people think they have more time. They don't." He handed me a sealed envelope. "If anything happens to me, give this to Ava." I accepted it quietly. I hope I never have to. So do I. As I stood to leave, he called my name one more time. "Daniel, promise me something." "Anything." "If the world ever offers you power, don't let it take your kindness." A few days later, I proposed to Ava. There were no reporters, no expensive restaurant, no orchestra, just the two of us, standing beside the same waterfront where she'd asked me on our first date. I don't have the perfect words. I've never been good at speeches. She smiled. "I know. But I do know one thing. I've loved you since long before I believed someone could love me back." I knelt down. "Ava Harrington, will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes. She laughed through them. "I was wondering how much longer you were going to make me wait. Yes. 1,000 times yes." As I slipped the ring onto her finger, neither of us knew that someone watching from inside a parked car had just made a phone call. "The engagement is official. Start the plan." I thought the hardest part of my life was over. I was wrong. 3 days after our engagement, the attacks began. Anonymous emails arrived at the board of directors. They accused me of manipulating William Harrington, of using Ava to gain power. Every accusation was a lie. But lies have a dangerous advantage. They spread faster than truth. The media picked up the rumors. Headlines questioned my motives. Television commentators debated whether I was a gold digger in a suit. I stopped reading the news. Ava didn't. One evening, I found her sitting alone in William's library. Her laptop was open. Tears filled her eyes. "They're calling you a fraud." I gently closed the screen. People who don't know me have always made up stories. This one's just louder. She reached for my hand. "I'm scared." "Of what?" "That one day, all this pressure will make you walk away." I smiled. "I spent my whole life being ignored. You think gossip is going to scare me?" She laughed through her tears. At that moment, William entered the room. He looked exhausted. Without saying a word, he handed me a folder. Inside were copies of financial records, fake contracts, forged signatures, Secret payments. What is this? William sighed. Someone inside my company has been stealing from us for years. He looked directly at me. And now they're trying to destroy you before you discover who they are. The next several weeks became a blur. I worked with forensic accountants, auditors, attorneys. Every trail led deeper into the company. Then, late one Friday night, I found it. One forgotten transaction connected every fake company, every missing dollar, every forged document. The money didn't disappear overseas. It ended in an account controlled by one man, the company's chief financial officer. He had spent nearly 8 years quietly stealing millions. When William learned the truth, he didn't celebrate. He simply closed his eyes. I trusted him. The following Monday, the board gathered for an emergency meeting. The CFO walked into the room smiling confidently. He had no idea that every document he had forged, every lie he had told, and every dollar he had stolen, was about to be placed on the conference table in front of everyone. The boardroom was silent. No one spoke as William placed the evidence on the conference table. The chief financial officer glanced at the documents, then looked back at us with forced confidence. I assume there's been some misunderstanding. I slid another folder toward him. There hasn't. Every transfer, every shell company, every forged signature, they all lead back to you. His face turned pale. One director slowly removed his glasses. Another leaned back in disbelief. William looked at the man he'd trusted for nearly 20 years. I treated you like family. The CFO lowered his head. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then, he quietly admitted everything. Security escorted him from the building. By evening, every news station in Seattle was covering the scandal. The headlines changed overnight. The man they'd called a fraud had uncovered one of the largest corporate thefts in the company's history. A week later, William invited Ava and me to his home. He looked healthier, calmer. He smiled as we sat together. You know, I've spent most of my life searching for the right successor. I thought I was looking for the smartest person. I was wrong. He looked directly at me. I should have been looking for the kindest. 3 months later, Ava and I were married. It wasn't held in a luxury hotel. There were no television cameras. No celebrity guests. Just our families, our closest friends, and the same little coffee shop where we'd first met. After the ceremony, Ava handed me a small wrapped gift. Inside was my old notebook, the one I'd dropped on the coffee shop floor years earlier. She smiled. I borrowed it from your apartment. You've filled every page. It's time to write a new chapter. That night, I opened a brand new notebook. On the first page, I wrote only one sentence. The world spent years judging my face, until one woman chose to see my heart. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't have understood as a lonely little boy. Beauty fades. Money comes and goes. Power changes hands. But kindness quietly changes lives forever. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever believed you weren't enough, I hope you remember my story. Because the people who overlook you today don't get to decide who you become tomorrow.